I thought this man was praying, and I thought one had fallen over and one was praying because of the position. But it was actually they'd had a dispute with somebody over parking. The man had gone away, come back with a shotgun and shot the young lad through his head, and he just collapsed in a kneeling position, and then shot the older man, who then collapsed on the floor. My name is Parm Sandhu. I became a chief superintendent within the Met, and in the 189 years of the history of the Met, there's never been a black or Asian woman who's actually achieved that rank within the Metropolitan Police Service. There have been people who've been at higher ranks, but they've been brought in from other forces, so no homegrown talent. You know, there have been obstacles along the way. There have been a huge amount of obstacles. I mean, it started on day one. I wasn't quite 5'4", and you need to be 5'4". So I turned up, and I'm 5'3.5". So I turned up with my hair all fluffed up on my head, back combed, everything, just to get myself in there. And then later on in my service, it was, you know, I'm a mother as well, and my marriage collapsed. And I remember sitting in a chair and my boss saying to me, well, now you can make a choice. You can either be a police officer or you can be a mother. Well, I disagree. I don't think you do need to make those choices, especially in this day and age. You can be both. You can do any job that you want to, and you can be a parent as well. And it doesn't matter whether you're the mother or the father, you can do both. The teams that I worked on are mainly men. And as a woman, you've got to think about your own family commitments. You've got to think about, physically, I'm not as big and strong as everybody else, but I can talk my way out of a situation. You know, some of my colleagues, especially the men, they could afford to have a fight in the street. I couldn't, because I would get hurt. So for me, it was important that communication and building rapport with people, the community, and even people in crisis, even as suspects. If you can talk your way out of a situation, isn't that better than getting hurt yourself and hurting that individual? It's better to change the organisation, join the Metropolitan Police or any other force. It's better to change the force and how they behave and how they deal with our communities from within. It's when you're standing on the outside, you have no influence, you have no power, and you cannot make the changes that we need to make. Policing needs to evolve, and that's right up and down the country. One of the very first murder scenes that I went to and investigations that I was involved with was a young nurse over in the East End of London. There was blood, there were distressed children, there were distressed members of the family. I can still remember the chaos and the mayhem, and walking in and thinking, I'm responsible for this. You have a responsibility to the family and the community as well. When I had to go and tell the grandparents of those children that their daughter had died, and the way that they reacted to me was, well, why have you brought the children here? Why isn't the son-in-law looking after them? Adding to the pain that I had already caused them by telling them that their daughter had been murdered, I then had to make it even worse by telling them that it was their son-in-law who had killed their daughter. And now those little babies, those little kids, didn't have a mother. Their father was going to be locked up in prison, and they, as elderly people, as elderly grandparents, had the responsibility for two very young children. And the times that you have to deal with the perpetrators, you have to deal with these awful people who have committed that crime in a professional way. You've got to be respectful, you've got to be polite, and you've got to almost create a friendship with them so that they trust you enough to tell you what's happened. Because if you don't have that rapport with them, and they close up and they don't tell you and they don't make the admissions or they don't explain what the situation is, when you go to court, you've got nothing. You have to have evidence, you have to have the right evidence, and you have to prove the case. You've got to make sure that you maintain that professionalism and that respect, which is why you can never prepare. You can never go into a crime scene and think, I'm not going to get emotionally involved, because you don't know what you're going to see. You don't know who's been involved, who's been killed, and how, and what they did to them first. One of the hardest cases that I've ever been involved in was one where it was almost like an execution of an uncle and a nephew, and it was over a parking spot. So somebody had come back with a shotgun, and when we were called, I was the first officer on scene as well. So I went to this little alleyway, and there's a young lad who's kneeling on the floor, and there's an older man who's sprawled out on the floor. And initially, I thought this man was praying, and I thought one had fallen over and one was praying because of the position of the bodies. But it was actually they'd had a dispute with somebody over parking. The man had gone away, come back with a shotgun, and shot the young lad through his head, and he just collapsed in a kneeling position, and then shot the older man, who then collapsed on the floor. Now, for me, it was one of the hardest things was it was a stranger, so there were no links to the people. It wasn't family, friend, or somebody who'd had some previous dealings with these people. It was literally over where they had parked a car. So you've got to painstakingly put together the statements from the witnesses. There was a niece, so the sister of the boy was there, and the man had tried to shoot her as well, but the gun had jammed. So she was distraught, she was absolutely tearful, and you can understand that, but we've got to get a statement from her. And then you've got to try and get statements from all the people around, and you've got to look for CCTV, you've got to look for any sort of forensics. But because these people have never actually touched each other or had any interactions, it makes it even more difficult to investigate it. Most police officers, they develop coping mechanisms, and one of my coping mechanisms was I would compartmentalise everything. So I would lock it away in a box. I would never go home and talk about what I'd seen or what I'd done. I would go home and I would give my child an extra hug, and I would go and look at my son sleeping in the cot, and I'd make sure he was safe and sound. You can't ever forget. You can't really share it either. And that's why some police officers develop a sort of a black sense of humour, or sick sense of humour, you could call it, because that is a way to cope with it. You laugh at the most ridiculous things, you laugh at the most awful things, but that is how you compartmentalise, and that is how you store it in your head so that it doesn't affect you every single day of your life. One of the funniest incidents that we dealt with was that we were called to a crematorium, and they found that after their ashes, when they go through the ashes and the body had already been burnt of this lady, they'd found 2 skulls. And there was a skull of the lady that had been buried or cremated, and there was also a smaller skull. So they called us because they thought a second body had been snuck into this coffin and had then been incinerated. It turned out that in some cultures, they bury a coconut with the body, and it's supposed to be something to do with the afterlife. So we were searching through all these ashes and things, looking at what we thought was a skull, and when we got it forensicated and checked out, it was actually the husk of a coconut that had been buried in with this lady. So that was one of the most ridiculous things that we were ever called to.